All right. Hi, everybody. This is Dr. Leslie Blevins with Enilda Clinic. And today I have a very special guest. She is Brandie Rosen, and she has a master's in education, and she has 25 years of experience in special education. She does a few different things. So I'm going to read through her biography and give you the spill on this. So she was a special education teacher. She's also been a special education administrator. She's worked in the district. She's been a school trainer. She's been a special education consultant. She's facilitated over 5,000 IEPs. She's worked on district-wide programs and done training with thousands of teachers. Just tons and tons of stuff. I'm super excited to have her here. And Brandie, you feel free to fill in any gaps that I'm not mentioning. Today, what we're going to talk about, everybody, is how to write effective IEP goals. And Brandie, just so you know, the big audience that I tend to have are parents, but then also many times I'll have schools that will watch as well. And then after we talk about IEP goals, we're going to talk about what teachers can do to effectively work with anxiety in their students in the classroom. So these are two topics that come up all the time whenever I'm working with parents in my clinic. And so I'm so excited to have you here, Brandie. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So any gaps in your experiences that you want to just kind of fill in real quick, things related to what we're chatting about today?
Not really. Just that I also work with a lot of parents, and so the idea of writing IEP goals should not just be a school responsibility. I think it's really important that parents understand the process because they are part of the team, and I think the more that parents understand kind of what what the goal of a goal is and how to develop that, the more actively they feel they can be a part of the IEP team as well as a part of their child's progress. So I think it's really important across the board for everybody to understand that process.
I love it. I love it so much. I want to know a little bit more about your progression across your career and how you ended up in this spot of supporting parents and teachers. It sounds like you almost support both sides. Like you're kind of this person who's just there for the kid. And how did you get there? Because I just love that.
So I started teaching. The majority of my experience has been with students with emotional and behavioral disorders and kids with autism. And so over the years, I've had experience in environments where I had parents who were very, very involved and other, schools where parents were not able to be involved very much, whether that was a language barrier or a socioeconomic barrier, just a varied reasons. And so as I moved through teaching, which has always been my passion and my love, and really working with those challenging kids, I started to see how much impact you can have when you can support parents through the process, just in things like, helping them to see kind of the beauty in their child and not just get the negative phone calls and the negative information, and how they can kind of feel empowered to be a positive part of that process, as opposed to either feeling left out or feeling like they're always fighting. And so as I moved through my career, I was a behaviorist for a district. I've created behavioral programs in the districts I've worked in. And I kind of incorporate that behavioral thinking into how to help parents be a part of the process. Because what I found in these last years as an administrator and sitting in very contentious IEPs is that so much of the time, the reason we are at the place we are is because parents are not understanding the process, or they don't feel like they're a part of the process. And so, I had a really eye-opening experience where we were sitting in an IEP and the team was very excited about setting up this behavioral intervention for a student. And I could see the parent's face, and I thought, they're not hearing what we're saying. They're hearing something different. So I just stopped and I said to the parents, what do you hear us saying? And they were like, we hear you saying that he's the worst kid in this class and that you don't know what to do with him. And I was like, wow, I thought that's what you were hearing, but that's not at all what we were saying. We were saying, gosh, we're so excited because we know exactly where we want to take him. We know exactly what to do. We're educators, but they weren't there yet. So I think really understanding that piece of when you don't have everybody on board, kids just don't make the same amount of progress. And, if we keep it centered on really student progress, then kids move so much faster.
I just love that so much. I've been on both sides of it. I've been a special education teacher. I've been a school psychologist inside the schools. And now, of course, I work in a private clinic as a licensed psychologist. And so what I've really noticed is that there's like this growth of parents across time. And I always like to say to my parents whenever I render a diagnosis for their child that they're now a baby parent. And they are learning the special education system, and they're going into the school, and they don't know how it works. They're just sitting there and they're being bombarded by all this information.
Yeah.
Not only are they going through a grieving process for their kid,
right,
and this new life that they're now reimagining for them, but they're also coping with everybody in their child's life telling them what their opinion is about their kid.
Right. And everybody's an expert all of a sudden.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. And so it takes years. And as the years go on, the parent develops this toughness. I like to call them the Bulldog Parent. By the time the kid graduates from high school, you got the Bulldog Parent.
Yeah.
Like, I am the expert of my child. And they're there, and they know how to advocate for their kid.
Right. Right.
And it's a beautiful growth process because the parent feels so empowered by the end. And I just love that you're in that role to be there to help them to advocate for their child, because I know in the beginning parents just feel overwhelmed by it.
Yeah, and I think that they either go, when I work with parents, I say to them, so if you were, if you walked into a hospital setting, say, and there was something medically wrong with your child, the first thing you would do is you would listen to the advice, right? You would go to the experts and you would listen to the advice. And most of the time you're going to take their advice because they're the experts in their field. And sometimes you're going to question things and you're going to get second opinions, and that's your job as a parent. But the first job is to listen to what people who are experts in the field are saying. And so I caution parents often when I work with them. I say, be careful, about the Facebook communities and your, best friend who knew a kid who had this. That's not expert advice. And just like for, if they had a medical condition, you wouldn't go to your neighbor over coffee and ask them what you would do. You would go to an expert. And so I think that overwhelmed feeling comes from all this information. Everybody's throwing all this and they don't know what to listen to. So I try and quiet that down a little bit. Like, okay, let's just put all that aside and let's just look at right now. Let's look at what the information that we have, because it really can be super overwhelming.
Sure. So let's jump into IEPs. Can we just start with a couple of basics for the listeners out there? What is an IEP and what is a goal for an IEP?
Okay. Yeah, absolutely. So there's a federal law and it's called IDEA, and it was developed to protect students with special needs. And within IDEA, it really lays out exactly what needs to be in place. And an IEP is an individualized education plan. You'll hear the same. You'll hear it used for both the paperwork and the meeting. We kind of use IEP for everything, and it's an individual plan that a team puts together to meet a student's unique needs, to assure that a student is making progress along their own kind of arc of progress. So an IEP will always include, a full IEP will always include where they're currently performing, then what goals we have, which I'll jump into that, and then accommodations and modifications, which lead to services and placement. So that's all kind of the plan and how we go through that. And I always tell teachers and parents, it's really important to remember that there's a reason that an IEP goes in the order that it goes in, because one leads to the next. So your present levels, your current levels of performance, they guide you into knowing what goals to write. So if your child is, say, reading at a first grade level, and is able to decode but is not able to do reading comprehension, that's all going to be the present level. That's where they're currently working. And then the goal, which is what we develop as a team, is going to be, where do we see them going in a year? Our goal is usually for a year, and we use that baseline or that information of where they are to help guide us. So the goals are based on deficits, which I always tell parents from the get-go, it's one of those kind of weird ideas, but an IEP is a deficit-driven program, meaning anything that the child is doing okay in, you won't see much in an IEP because they're doing great. We just go, yay, that's enough. That's not what we have to focus on. The goals are based on the deficit or what they need to work on. And when you get all your goals together, you basically, at the end of the development of goals, I always say to parents, does this sound like your child? So by the end of that, you should be looking at that and go, yeah, that pretty much wraps up, where my child's struggling. And then that guides what we're going to provide for services and placement and things like that. So the goals are really the heart and soul of the IEP. They're the piece that really tells us what we're going to do. A lot of times people want to jump to services. They think that's the most important part, but without, the services are kind of the icing on the cake. Without doing the goals, you don't have a cake. So we really want to focus on, I spend a lot of time focusing on the goals.
The goals are like the map.
Yeah. They're the lesson plan. So like in a general ed class, right, they would, have an idea of what needs to be taught, where they want it. They have learning strands that tell you where you're beginning, where you're ending. And for a student who has an IEP, we're kind of creating that same plan.
Sure. So my big question, I always had a hard time with this whenever I was a special education teacher, is, legally you're required to have one IEP meeting a year. You can have more, but it rarely happens until that parent develops into a Bulldog parent. And so
depends on your district, but yeah.
Yeah. And so one of the things that I would notice is that, my district, whenever I did it, and this was, over a decade ago, but they just had this computer system that was like a click and complete IEP for us. And so we're looking at the goals, and I taught special education math. And so I'm looking through the goals for the math. And so there might be, 2 or 3 goals I could choose for math, but they were so specific. And it was like, I would hope that kid would learn so much more than that across a year. And it was just so hard for me to gauge, like, what kind of goal am I going to choose for a year? Like, if I choose one that's big enough for a whole year, the kid's not going to make progress.
Right. Well, I think what's really important to remember, first of all, we don't write goals like that anymore. I mean, that actually goes against what IDEA says, because they should not be a click and go kind of IEP. Mm-hmm. You have to write individual goals for every student. And it's important that I'm really glad you brought this up, because it's really confusing for parents. So just because a student doesn't have a goal doesn't mean that we're not going to work on those skills, because in most cases, kids are going to be working on all the skills that, that are being taught in the classroom, not just those IEP goals. Those IEP goals are really supposed to be kind of drilled down to what areas is impacting that student's ability to access the curriculum. That's what, an IEP is for. So it might be that you're working on 30 skills in that school year, but there's 2 or 3 that are very specific to this student, where they need to be able to make progress on those skills to be able to access the rest of their learning. So never would everything be in an IEP. That would be an impossibility. So it really is those targeted skills where there's deficit areas. And go ahead.
So for instance, a child that has difficulty with reading comprehension, we might know from assessment that their reading fluency is poor. So there might be a targeted goal to improve their fluency by so many words per minute. And that would be a targeted IEP goal, Absolutely. Even though we know generally they're working to improve reading comprehension at grade level.
That absolutely. If we know that the reading fluency is what's interfering with that reading comprehension, then we might, but we also might write a goal for fluency, just a straightforward, this is how many words per minute. And then what we also know is that they're pretty good at the what questions and the when questions, but for their comprehension, the why question is really hard for them. So we might write a goal for reading fluency and for the why. It doesn't mean we're not going to be working on the what, the where, the when, but they're not struggling with that as much. And we'll know that because we've collected data. And so we're going to write that goal for the why, because that's the thing they're stuck with. So then when we look at those two pieces together, we, increase their fluency and we focus on that why, we feel like as a team, we're kind of pulling in what they need to be able to, do reading comprehension. So there's all these different pieces of it. Just like there is with everything, right? Like you kind of break it apart like you would from a behavioral perspective and break down all the skills that they need. And then we say, okay, this one we're going to work on, and this one we're going to work on. These, they've either got, or it might be they're not ready for those. We might say, you know what, we might need to do the fluency first. That's it. We can't even focus on anything until we get that fluency. So that's what we're going to do. Now, does that mean they're not going to do reading comprehension work? Of course not. An IEP does not define what you're doing in school. It defines what areas are being worked on.
Right. Via the special education curriculum, like that teacher giving extra support.
Yeah, depending on, then you get into services and placement, and then, that's determined by that piece. So sometimes, a student may need an alternative program or an extra program. Sometimes they might just need extra time. Sometimes they might need it broken down into smaller pieces. That again is really individualized. That's what makes, I think, IEPs so cool, because they're individualized for what a student needs.
Yeah, I love that so much. And I feel like that naturally leads into the big thing that I often see whenever I'm talking with parents is where's the data? So, and I know this has to be so frustrating for teachers too, but for parents even, they're like, I don't know how we came up with this goal, like that it came out of the sky somewhere.
Yeah. And, I wish I could give you a good answer on that, other than that should be a concern.
It should be the number one concern, right?
So, I mean, if a parent sits down to an IEP, and when I work with parents, I say the same thing, is they have to have data. And when I'm training my teachers, I say, data, I can support you in anything that you need as long as you have the data behind it. Mm-hmm. Because sometimes we'll sit down at the IEP, and a parent will say, I want a goal in this. And we'll say, okay, well, let's look at what data we have. And maybe, throughout my career, I've worked at, kind of different socioeconomics, different kind of achievement level schools. Mm-hmm. And so in one school district with very, very high achievement across the district, we might have a parent that comes in and says, I want my student to be doing A, B, and C. And we say, oh, well, that's, none of the kids are working on A, B, and C, or they can already do A, B, and C. Well, I want them to do it better. And so we can have the data and say, well, look, they're already performing at this level, which is great. We're super, that's time for a celebration. But if you don't have data, I don't know what to say about that, right? And so I think it's really important if a IEP team is saying we don't need that goal because they're fine, then as a parent, I'm going to say, you might be right. I'm open to hearing that, but I want to see the data on that. Or they might say they need this goal, and I don't necessarily think that they do. Then I might say, I need the data on that. And so it doesn't have to be, it shouldn't be clinic level data. So it should not look necessarily trial by trial, 1,000 hours of data collection a week. They're teaching. That's not what you want your teachers to be doing. But it has to be legitimate data that shows whether there's growth or a need in a certain goal area. So
it should be convincing to answer the question, right? Like, to me, the data, it can be like real-time data that's collected in the classroom. It can be from their regular work, but it should be convincing to answer whether or not
clear. It should be clear, absolutely, that it says like, this is the skill deficit,
right?
This is where they're working, and this is where we want them to be. Exactly. If there's, something that's not matching up, then we know where I mean, when I train teachers, I always say to them, and trust me, collecting data is, it is the nemesis of all teachers. There's no question about it. And it's legitimate. They've got a million kids. There's a million things going on. It's not like they have the joy of one person, I mean, that's just not how it is. It's hard. But I say, you have no idea how much time you're saving on the back end by taking the data at the beginning, because it's super easy then. If you write the goals, you have a data system in place, when it's time for that IEP again, you're done. It's like half the time because you've already done it. And so it's just a big mind shift. It feels overwhelming for teachers, but it's super critical. So, and I think that people overcomplicate it as well. They start to develop these very complicated data forms and whatever. And I'm like, yeah, you don't need all the bells and whistles. We just need to know, are they doing it? Or are they not doing it? How often, and part of that goes into how you write goals. So, kind of to bring it back to that, when I train teachers, so there has to be accuracy and consistency in a goal. So every goal has to have those two parts as part of the measurement. Mm-hmm. And that gets confusing to people a lot. But I always tell people to use a measurement system that they're comfortable with. So, you taught high school math. I did not, nor would I ever even dream of teaching high school math. And I am terrible at math. Okay, so that's my thing. But I'm really good at percentages. That was the one skill that I got really strong with. So when I write my goals, I almost always use a percentage, because it makes sense in my brain. Like, I can figure out the data much more clearly if I have a percentage, as opposed to a 3 out of 5, which I understand turns into a percentage, but it's still more complicated for me. So when teachers are, I encourage teachers to make it easier for themselves to use a system that works. So don't make it overly complicated. Don't think you have to do something that you don't know how to do. Use a measurement system that works for you. So that I think that takes a little bit of getting used to for new teachers, to just try and find their place with that.
Okay, cool. Okay, anything else that you want to say about IEPs or goals for IEPs before we switch over to what you tell teachers about anxiety?
A big switch, which, sometimes IEPs and anxiety, they go together. I think just really that, I just think it's really super important for everybody to remember, is that an IEP, it's not just something we have to get through to get done and put in the file until we look at next year. It really is our roadmap. And the more we work together to make it meaningful, the more power it has for teachers, for parents, and for kids. As opposed to just, like you said, a click and go, where nobody's going to use that for any information. Make it meaningful, because if you do, you then have your own roadmap. And so I just think that sometimes, I think across the board, parents and teachers get in their mind like, it's not really that important, it's not very useful. But it really, it can be, and it should be really, really important for kids with special needs to have that individualized, really meaningful IEP.
Yeah, absolutely. Awesome. Okay, so yeah, let's jump into anxiety inside the school. I know kids act all different kinds of ways whenever they're anxious at school. And so I'm wondering, what would you teach to a teacher to help that child?
Okay, so I come from a really behavioral background. That's my place. So what I have found is most helpful for teachers is to take the emotionality out of the experience, because when students are anxious, they don't, in most cases, they don't sit down and say, Miss So-and-so, I'm feeling anxious right now. I'd like to take a deep breath, right? They're going to display it in all kinds of acting out ways, because they don't have the skills yet to be able to, many of us as adults, right? We don't have those skills yet. And so I find that teachers get really kind of caught up in it. And so they get, they get in power struggles. They get in a lot of, either they get in power struggles really focusing on the behavior around the anxiety, or they get kind of caught up in the therapy side of it. Both are not good places for teachers to be. because that's not our job as teachers. And so, I always encourage my teachers to be very careful. They're not school psychologists and they're not therapists. And so you want to be careful about how much you go into the, what I call the mental health side of things, as opposed to the behavioral side of things. So I encourage teachers to find the support that they need from the mental health providers that are, that they have access to deal with the mental health side of things. And then we, as teachers, can deal with the more behavioral side of anxiety. And so what that means to me is working with teachers to identify what the function of the behavior is that they're seeing. So the reason that the student is displaying that behavior. Anxiety often is one of those functions or the reasons. So they're feeling anxious that they have to read aloud in front of the class because they're not a strong reader. So instead, they tip over their chair and throw their book and run out of the classroom. Because guess what? Now you're focused on the running out of the classroom and you're not going to make them read, and they don't have to have that anxiety. They'd rather get in trouble than feel that anxiety. So with kids, depending on the age, and again, if you're working with high school kids, there's going to be a little bit of a different conversation around this. They have more ability to access their emotional regulation a little bit better. But for younger kids, it's kind of our job to do that for them, to be able to help them. And so my first piece of advice is always going to be, identify what it is that you're seeing. That's going to be your first step, right? What is it that you're seeing? And most likely that's going to be a behavior, because that's how it's going to show us. And then the next is going to be, why are they doing that behavior? Mm-hmm. And so if they, through their search and their data collection, they find out that they think it's anxiety, that's what's causing this, then that tells us a lot about what we're going to do for that student. So let's say we find out, the same thing. You give an instruction to the class to read, and Johnny tips over the chair and runs out of the classroom. So your first response is might be, oh, he just gets away with everything at home, and he just needs a good talking to, right? And so you might even try that. Right. And then guess what happens? The behavior goes up and up and up because we're not focusing on what the real reason is. And so that's really, where that I say that it's like detective work. You have to kind of figure all that out. So let's say that we figure out that an anxiety response is guiding kind of these behaviors that we see. And it could be, it could be across the board. It could be acting out behavior. It could be very closing off behavior. It could be like self-stimulatory behavior, picking at things. There's a lot of different things that we could see. And then the next step is, what do you do about that? And a lot of times, like I said, once teachers believe that it's anxiety, what they often will do is give it a lot of they therapy it, right? And so they do a lot of the talking and trying to help, which is great, except a lot of times that actually escalates the students, because again, we're not therapists, and I remind them that every day. So we don't really have that skill level, and it's not necessarily even appropriate in the classroom. What we want to do is provide what they need to help them start to minimize their anxiety in that setting. We're not going to cure the world, and we're not going to cure what's going on with them, but we can help in our environment. So that might mean we need to minimize demands for a while. It might mean that we need to kind of make their space a little bit smaller. Maybe there's too much going on around them. It might mean we need to change up our schedule a little bit. It might mean they just need a break. It might mean that we might start working on teaching them some self-calming, some self-regulation skills that work for them, and start doing that together. So it really is, it's not changing the world around the student. It's helping the student find their way in that moment, because we can make a bubble, and we can never put anything in their path that causes them to feel anxious, or we can teach them together how to kind of regulate that anxiety. And then I say, in a lot of cases, at the same time, talking to the school psychologist, right? And saying, let's look at the behavioral piece, and let's look at the mental health piece together. And I think as families, as kids return to school in some fashion in the next months or years, I think that we are going to see a level of anxiety that we haven't seen maybe ever in my almost 30 years for students. I think they're going to be scared about coming back. They're going to be scared about not coming back. They're going to be, whatever has been happening in their lives for the last 6 months is going to be coming through that door. So I think that there's going to be a lot. I think that it's really an important issue right now.
Right, right. And for everybody out there watching, we're actually going to do a compliment interview where we're going to flip roles, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about anxiety too. So I'll post that on my website. So keep an eye out for that. We're going to continue this discussion. But I know that I can't take up all of your time. So is there anything else that you would like to say about teachers and anxiety in children?
I just think that I guess the one thing to remember is that I think oftentimes anxiety just looks different than anxiety, and it looks different than anxiety in adults. And so I just think we have to be really on watch for that, because it can look so different depending on the student and the age of the student. And we get confused by the behavior. And so we assume it's just a behavioral issue, and we miss the underlying things that are going on. So I think just really being aware of that is super important.
Yeah, I'll definitely say that whenever I have a kid come in, many times it's anxiety, but it's been, they have a prior diagnosis of ADHD, or
Right.
the parent might think that the kid has a behavior problem or something like that. And oftentimes we have to, go at the anxiety first. And then most of the time, all the behavior problems go away.
Right. Right.
Yeah. But it just looks that way. It just looks like a behavior problem.
Yeah, I mean that's all kids know. That's all they have. That's the only thing in their toolkit, right? Is behavior. And so and they don't have any of the other skills yet.
Right, exactly. Thank you so much for joining us, Brandie. I really appreciate it. I love everything that you said about anxiety. It was so helpful. It was amazing. I love it.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. It was a pleasure.
Yeah, and everything that you said about the goals with the IEP, they were amazing. I wish that I had that information back whenever I was a teacher. It would have been so helpful.
I know. Many years ago, things were different.
Yeah, I guess so. Okay, well, everybody out there, make sure that you subscribe. You can go to my website and you can get all these videos in your inbox. I release one per week, so you'll get another one next week. And yeah, I'll see you guys next time. Bye, everybody.